Hi, this is Scott Park Phillips, and today I'm interviewing Kyle Barrowman, and he is one of the luminaries in the recently created martial arts studies world. Uh, we first met in Cardiff, where he was I'm just going to call him the assistant to everything that was
Pretty much.
going on at the first couple of conferences. And now he has a professor's position at Columbia College in Chicago. And I don't know much about what you're doing now, so maybe you can tell me just in general. But we're going to talk today about an essay he wrote called Bruce Lee and the Perfection of Martial Arts Studies and Exercise in Interdisciplinarity.
Long title.
Yeah, but also just in general about what martial arts studies is or is becoming. And so, yeah, tell me a little bit about what you're doing right now.
Sure. I appreciate the intro. I will clarify the professor position is just part-time. I'm doing adjunct stuff around the Chicago area. So I do part-time stuff at Columbia College Chicago, at DePaul University, at College of Lake County, and then we'll see about other options. But what I do primarily is film studies. So I am a film scholar when it comes to martial arts studies. The way in for me is through film and media representations. That's how I found it. But yeah, what I do as quote unquote my day job and what I do for a living is study film and teach film history, aesthetics, appreciation, criticism, all the stuff involving film.
It sounds so much more interesting than what I have planned. So I'm going to promise everyone that we will get to talking about that specifically, because yeah, why not? But I wanted you. So here's what happened actually. So Paul Bowman, who is a little more central in the martial arts studies creation.
A lot more. Me.
I had a dumb internet argument with him where he said, "Oh, you should talk to Kyle. You guys think the same," something like that. And
what was the argument about, out of curiosity?
And so then I read your essay. Well, in the argument, I don't actually remember the argument, but I just said, "Look, you're really not, you're." I said something like you're essentializing Chinese thought when in fact what you've got there is a subject that's been mediated by people like Thoreau, Walden Pond, and that kind of thing that Chinese have been reading, and Mark Twain. And so you're not actually getting a straight version. What you're calling traditional isn't, something to that effect.
Okay.
And so, yeah, that's the setup there. Well, what else should I say about martial arts studies? Yeah, I'll come back to that. I could do an introduction to what are we, but let's start with the problem. You were his student, and you spent a lot of time studying postmodernism and post-structuralism.
Yep.
And what happened?
Well, I should say that the phrase "long story short" really isn't in my vocabulary. All my stories are very long, so I can give the long version, the setup. But yeah, I was initially introduced to him, and then by extension, martial arts studies through his Bruce Lee book and my own writing on Bruce Lee. So this goes back to 2012 when I published an essay on Bruce Lee in a film journal called Offscreen. And that was while I was still doing my undergrad, and I'd had one thing published prior, which was based on a school assignment, a paper that I wrote. So the first real piece of scholarship that I ever composed, sat down and said, okay, let me do research, let me write about it, was an essay on Bruce Lee, because of course everything's going to start with Bruce Lee with me. So reading around on it, I found a book in full, free to look at and read on some site called academia.edu, and it was by a guy named Paul Bowman, and it was called Theorizing Bruce Lee. I was like, wow, someone has written a book all about Bruce Lee? So I was ecstatic, and then I read it. I was like, I love how much I hate this book. And I say that as a compliment to him and his writing, but I love fighting with all of this. This is a serious engagement with Bruce Lee, completely different to everything that I think, using completely different methods and ideas and tools and arguments. I was like, this is fun. I want to be in this world, and I want to talk about it like this, just from slightly different perspectives and coming from different thinkers. So I published that essay, took a couple of shots at him for fun, and then at the end of that year is when he put out the call for that issue of the JOMEC journal on something called martial arts studies. So I got my essay, I submitted that to him, and that's pretty much what started it all. So from the end of 2012 to mid 2014, that's the interminably long publication process. You submit the thing, get it approved, you do the peer review, you do the revision, all that good stuff. Throughout that year and a half, we started a little email conversation, just shooting the shit, talking about, hey, let's talk about Bruce Lee, let's talk about Kill Bill. Do you watch MMA? It was just, we started that conversation going. And by the time that the essay got published in JOMEC Journal about martial arts studies, I'd now gotten my master's, and I was starting to look for PhD opportunities. And I just so happened to see that he put up a call on his martial arts studies blog for an international student scholarship at Cardiff. So I was sitting in Chicago, hadn't even started the PhD application process yet. I was like, scholarship, you'll pay me to come over there and I can hang out with a dude and talk about Bruce Lee for 3 years? Sign me up. So I applied for that and I happened to get it. And the conversation that we had, he knows sort of the way I think and the way I approach things. And what I told him explicitly from day one, I likened it to an MMA analogy because I like MMA. And I thought of it in particular with the fighter Mirko Cro Cop, the striker, that I told him that I don't agree with any of the stuff that you think. I think it's all hooey and nonsense, but I want to explore it with someone who is an expert in it, the same way that someone like a Cro Cop will train wrestling or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's not doing it to become a wrestler or to become a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter. He's doing it to become better at striking, to be able to deal with this stuff that he doesn't like. So him the same thing, that I'm doing this to basically be better at what I do and to learn how to critique this stuff by knowing it as deeply as I can. And what better sparring partner than an expert in post-structuralism?
All right, that was good. So he's pioneered something called alter disciplinarity.
Yeah.
And you say that let's just jump to the good intentions. What are?
Sure. So that was like a small essay that he published years ago in just like a random cultural studies journal. And then in one of his early books, I believe Deconstructing Popular Culture from 2008, that's kind of folded into the conclusion. And the basic idea of it is sound, and I love it, and it's my favorite thing that he's ever written that doesn't involve Bruce Lee. But the basic idea is being able to structure conversations not only within disciplines or within paradigms, but across disciplines and between paradigms. And it's a kind of methodological and even ethical orientation of, I'm going to understand your arguments based on your terms in relation to your ideas, so that if we're having a conversation, it's not cross purposes, it's not sort of in our own echo chambers with our own biases so that we just miss each other and it's not even a real conversation. It's, I want to understand your terms, speak on your terrain, and then we can work and maybe critique, possibly transform, but at least understand each other in our own separate worlds with our own concepts, as opposed to the more postmodern dogmatic idea that different concepts mean different worldviews, mean different realities, and never the twain shall meet. Multidisciplinarity, in a way, even though it's within that post-structuralist context, it's rejecting that. It's something completely different, and it's something that is a lot more valuable epistemologically and ethically, in my opinion. So the seed there, I absolutely loved, and I will quote that essay forever because there's so many pieces of it that I love. It's just that when you then try to do that in a post-structuralist context, it falls apart. And so that was sort of my claim.
And it falls apart because the two primary posits of post-structuralism are objectivity is an illusion and truth is subordinate to power.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with The thing with postmodernism, post-structuralism is the essential, let's call it tactical problem that they face is that they want to challenge things that you can't avoid using if you want to do something positive. In other words, deconstruction, postmodernism, post-structuralism, whatever terms you want to use, it's very negative in the sense that deconstruct, destruct, take apart, coming from Heidegger's notion of destruction in German, however you pronounce that. Apologies to German martial studies people. But coming from the Heideggerian worldview, that everything, you're breaking it apart, you're taking it apart, there isn't much emphasis on the reconstruction part, on what comes next, what do you do next? So you can take stuff apart and you can challenge reality and you can say, oh, objectivity is just an illusion or a power game, it's your own subjective biases. Okay, but then when the postmodernists start to play in the terrain of sort of political economy, and then you're going to make a claim to me that capitalism is objectively and inherently evil, and you're going to make a positive argument about the value of Marxism, you can't do that. And the can't there is a logical can't. You can go ahead and do it, and it's going to lead you into performative contradiction. But you cannot do that logically. And those types of issues, it's like running into a wall. And that's what you do when you watch postmodernists, post-structurists try to argue. Just banging their head against the wall. And it's like, you know, the thing you said over here, that's true. You can't do the opposite over here. That's a problem.
Okay, so let me slow you down for a second.
Sure.
Where this leads in your essay is to, and I may say it more strongly than you did, but using post-structuralism or postmodernism to understand Bruce Lee is ultimately to completely fail to understand Bruce Lee. And so, but we'll come back to that. Well, I don't know. Did you ever read Achieving Our Country by Richard Rorty?
No. I've read some of Richard Rorty, but I haven't read that.
So I'm going to summarize it for you. It was one of the last things he wrote, last books he wrote. And I should say I at one point dated his personal assistant.
Oh, really?
Yeah, her name was Super Chick, and she also had been the personal assistant for who's the guy who did Pink Flamingos?
John Waters?
Yes, she had been the personal assistant of John Waters. So I got a kind of an inside track on all this. You know, I got to look at all the highlighted parts of, you know, Derrida and stuff. And like, whoa. Anyway, Rorty's book, Achieving Our Country, is an apology. He's apologizing for having translated all of the postmoderns. He's basically saying, I was a red diaper baby. I was completely ideologically blind, and I translated all this stuff, and it's junk. We should really be reading Walt Whitman first, and probably not even bother with the postmoderns. Is what Rorty, who is most famous for having translated most of the postmoderns into English from French. And
you know, I apologize. I'm going to apologize for interrupting, but yeah, I wanted to mention that it's interesting to me that story is paralleled by another story and something that I wrote. And in both cases, I didn't even know of this existence, which says a lot about academia. But I did not know that Richard Rorty thing even existed. But I know Richard Rorty very well, and I know the postmodern version of Richard Rorty. But I never knew that bit of the story. By the same token, in my world of film studies, there was a man named Peter Wolin who was the person who really inaugurated the post-structuralist, postmodern perspective and era in film studies. His book, Signs and Meaning in Cinema, massive. It's one of the biggest books ever. 30 years later, he wrote an essay apologizing and saying, I was just caught up by Roland Barthes. The essay is ridiculous, but I felt the need to kind of work some stuff into it and blah, blah, blah. It's like, how many people who cite this and read this know about this one? It's so bizarre that happens, but it does.
Yes, and well, so Rorty actually coined a phrase that I like to use, which is the narcissism of good ideas, which is to say that there are these ideas that sort of catch hold, and for whatever reason, they're really hard for people to drop, even when they've become, I don't know, you can drown yourself in them, I guess, is the to take the Greek myth there.
Yeah.
Um, but well, Rand, you got into Rand a little bit. I'm not a deep Rand person, but Ayn Rand. But the objective reality, you mostly are using her to describe objective reality, and I kind of would push back against that. Maybe not. Maybe you'd end up agreeing with me entirely, but I think that you have you have a kind of relativism in postmodern modernity that is about taking away the basis by which we make ethics, undermining the basis by which we create ethics. But there's another type of, anthropology has a type of relativism. Gertz or Schweider, Richard Schweider is particularly developed, and a lot of people have built on his work now. And Clifford Gertz really is sort of the father of relativism in anthropology, and they're both they're ethicists. They want you to find the basis for your ethics. They're just saying that there are many different bases for ethics in different cultures, and even within cultures, different framings. You can frame ethics around a family, you can frame it around an individual, you can frame it around divinity, you can frame it around the supremacy of a state. There are lots of different ways you can frame an ethic, and come up with conflicting ethics. But it doesn't mean I think it's, if I can quote Schweider, you can have a view from somewhere, you can have a view from anywhere, and you can have a view from nowhere. And the postmoderns tend to take this view from nowhere, and that might be useful sometimes, but not for ethics, and in this case, not for understanding Bruce Lee.
Yeah, and I don't know that quote, I don't know that author, I don't know the work, so I don't know the context, but just in general, when it initially hits me, I don't understand how you can have a view from nowhere. That seems logically impossible. You're always in a place, you're always in a position, you're always in a context, you're always somewhere.
Yeah, it's this attempt to step back and say that it's a contradiction, right? There's no hierarchy. There's no hierarchy of value.
I think there has to be. The second you value something, then you've instantly created your own hierarchy. Maybe you call it a personal hierarchy of value, and you maybe wouldn't want to extend it to everybody, which is fair enough, but I don't believe in the possibility of the flattening of things, including values.
Yeah, well, so let's see if I can give an example. But I don't think it's very important to this conversation. But I'm
an irritating stickler like that. It's just I heard something and that's what I thought of it.
Yeah. So the point is that you could try to you could take as a value that you were taking yourself out of the equation, and an attempt to have an objective view that doesn't prioritize one culture over another. So in the sense of truth.
Yeah. Right. So that gets into like you can call it cultural relativism.
Yeah. Extreme cultural relativism is one where is a view from nowhere. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And the popular meme line, the different culture hard to judge, that's where it gets into like that extreme, like, okay, different, yeah, but I think we can still have some sort of common basis as we're all humans to say that's insane or that might not be advisable. That's where I push on the idea of relativism.
So I think that that's a fundamental question, but I also want to I want to lay that out there, but I want to come back to it. Like, what culture versus biology? Can we solve the Bruce Lee problem? Right. So let's see. What else should I throw out here? Well, I think because you and I agree, we may not have made the case as clearly as we could have. So, postmodernism has a whole process of gatekeeping and exclusion, and a way in which, and I think this is maybe I should ask you, what do you think? Isn't this a bit of a problem for martial arts studies itself, in that there seems to be some sort of requirement that you engage?
Yeah, it's in my own experience, I would say that one of the things that I find, let's say, unfortunate, that it's never a two-way street with postmodernism, post-structuralism, call it whatever you want. It's never a two-way street. And what I mean is that I've had conversations with different types of people where it's like, okay, I'm going to read your stuff, and I'm going to think about your stuff, and I'm going to engage with your stuff, but you have never heard of my stuff, and you're never going to read my stuff, and you don't want to read my stuff, and that's okay, which is strange, and I don't like that. So I've often joked with people, like, I dated someone who was doing a post-structuralist thesis. I've read more post-structuralism than she did. Like, I was giving her sources. It's like one of those weird things where I have the requirement, I've got to read the Bartzian canon. I've got to read the Foucauldian canon. I have to know the Derridian canon. But nobody has ever read J.L. Austin, and they're probably not going to, which is weird. And it's a kind of like a default or a de facto, like, this is the language of this stuff, so this is how we write it. And that doesn't have the kind of, whatever you want to call it, openness or adventurousness. But I come into something and, what do I think is relevant here? How can I think about this or talk about this? I wouldn't necessarily do the same sort of Emersonian, Randian type of thing that I did in the Bruce Lee essay. I wouldn't do that with everything. It's not going to be relevant or the useful framework for absolutely everything, but there's sort of a de facto, this is the way we do it, these are the tools, this is the framework. It's like, that might not work here. That might not be useful at best. At worst, that might be counterproductive. That might keep you from understanding certain things.
Right. So let's talk about that a little bit. So here's this. We have these essays by Bruce Lee. We know he took some high school, college level philosophy classes, and then he writes about, he's writing about martial arts, but he's also writing about he's giving sort of an intro to philosophy of sorts, and people have a bunch of people have tried to, like, interpret it, or, like, make it bigger, or where did it come from, how is it relevant, those sort of questions. And you pointed out that it probably comes mostly from Emerson.
I mean, in the sense that, and I don't know how clear it was in the essay, I don't know, but I wrote it, and other people are going to interpret it however they are. They'll see things or not see connections. But from my perspective, what I found the most interesting, and what continued to interest me to where I wrote, yes, you could call it some kind of companion piece, but another essay on Bruce Lee and perfectionism from a Confucian context. But what I find most interesting is not the sense that Bruce Lee read Ralph Waldo Emerson, he has self-reliance open next to him, and he composes Liberate Yourself from Classical Karate. That's not the main idea. It's more like, where are these perspectives coming from? What are the ideas and positions that inform these people? And it seems, whatever he happened to have read, it seems just the personality, the ethos, the ideas that Bruce Lee was espousing, what he kind of stood for, how he approached life, how he expressed himself, it sounds closest to my ear, Emersonian language, Emersonian ideas. And that was sort of the connection that I wanted to make. Like, this stuff, I'm hearing this, maybe we should explore this in this context.
Well, I think, and so that's what I think is extremely important, because I shouldn't really claim to be self-taught. my father had a radio show called Social Thought, and for 10 years, the publisher sent him books, and he interviewed, I don't know, hundreds of people, who are, many of whom are well known, many of whom are not well known, uh, in the ideas about how institutions think was the tagline. So I got a lot from that, and I've always been a reader, and I have my own family. My great aunt started a camp called Camp Walden, which still exists, and she was a member of the Ethical Culture Society. She went to Columbia in about 1901 or something like that, and started the most elite school in New York City, where the Oppenheimer brothers went to school, as many other people. It's in the Outliers book. In fact, if you ever seen the Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, mentions my great aunt's school. So there was definitely a philosophical tradition there. They were Jews from the Berlin tradition, living in New York, who got deep into Transcendentalism as a kind of path for taking Judaism into modernity. And so, I kind of grew up with that as a background, so when I read Thoreau, and it was an excuse to quit, cut school, in a sense. But here's the thing, I'm going to go on a little bit longer here, and then you can stop me actually if you want. But Thoreau was reading Chinese texts when he wrote. Right, this trend. Emerson and Thoreau were both reading Chinese texts. We know what they had in their library. They mention them, in fact, sometimes. We know what copies of the Tao Te Ching they had. Which translations. We know the Confucius translations. We know they were both interested in the Vedas and the Upslandas, Indian. So they were both studying to some extent some Sanskrit, and so they were deep into this thing, right? What is that other thing? And in fact, I think it's not very well known about the Enlightenment, like the Spinoza and all of his co-creators of the Enlightenment were also getting these texts from China. They got the Jesuit translations of the history of time from the Chinese point of view, which had a massive effect on people's thinking. They had the translations of Confucius and other things, and so that's not that far away from. It's not that far away from us, actually.
Right.
This back and forth is going on, and then, we get up to we know that Walden Pond is translated into Chinese probably in the 30s, 40s. It's pretty likely that Bruce Lee, who was a reader, who did read, he didn't like school, but he did like reading, probably read it. He probably almost certainly read Mark Twain, which was also translated at the time when he would have been in school. And, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. And as well as many other things, because I'm throwing it in there because Mark Twain wrote a lot about China, and in fact called himself a boxer. He was his first self outing as an anti-imperialist was to say, I am in sympathy with the boxers. I am a boxer of the Boxer Uprising. Even though he was mainly criticizing missionaries and their hypocrisy in looting, basically, but the entire idea of imperialism. And so these authors got translated into Chinese in the 20th century, and not just translated, like the major writers of the people who started writing in vernacular Chinese, who started writing essays in vernacular Chinese, which was really a creation of the early 20th century. There was vernacular Chinese in the sense of some religious texts that you could just read directly, but most Chinese you couldn't speak it, you had to read it. And they were writing essays that were where the writing was like spoken language, starting after the Boxer Uprising, and they were if they could speak English, which many of them could at that point because their schools were American missionaries. They were reading Twain, they were reading Thoreau right from the beginning, and so they influenced how Chinese language is constructed, which is a wild thought, but the what Bruce Lee was reading was heavily influenced by that. And I'll just tag one thing on here. After the Cultural Revolution in late 70s, 1980s, when people started to read again, because books were completely banned for 10 years, except for the Mao's Red Book, one of the books they started reading was Walden Pond. And the bizarre thing about Walden Pond is it was translated using Taoist language. So for a lot of scholars now who study Daoism, their first introduction to Taoist language was from reading Walden Pond. And you can go all the way back to the beginning, right, and look at Walden Pond and see actually how he organized it in terms of Taoist ideas as he saw them at that time. So it makes sense, but there's this back and forth going on.
Yeah.
And so at the time when Bruce Lee, what does he even think he's writing? Maybe he does think it's Taoist, but it's actually, and maybe it is, but it's been filtered through Emerson, right?
Yeah, and that's that sort of network, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, when you mention that, I will not pretend to be a Thoreau expert. I am not. Most of my Thoreau is secondhand from Stanley Cavell. I know Emerson far more than I know Thoreau.
Yeah,
but
cool.
What I like and all of that makes sense. And if you didn't say that, I would have prompted you to say it anyway, because I've never heard any of that. But what I do like, and what motivated in particular that second Bruce Lee essay of mine about Confucius stuff, was in a kind of weird way to connect back to what we were talking about earlier about how I don't really buy the cultural relativism stuff, because you can see these types of networks and these connections with whatever time period you're looking at, whatever culture you're looking at, whatever language you're looking at. It sounds so similar. Like, who's listening to whom, or who's thinking what? And it's like, yeah, we're finding a lot of these same ideas. Between one of the things I quoted in that essay was Emerson. It sounds exactly like an old school Neo-Confucian from like 5 centuries before. It's like, okay, is this coincidence, or are these people operating on the same wavelength here, regardless of the cultural and temporal differences? That's one of the things that I find particularly interesting. And then Bruce Lee as the figure who's sort of connecting all these different ideas, cultures, time periods, that just makes it all the more fascinating.
But I'll also, to push back, it could be a translation problem. Because
what do you mean, that the reason that the Confucius doodle sound like Emerson is if someone's making it more Englishified and connecting it to Emersonian language?
Yeah, because so you take a word like virtue, which is de in Chinese, which it could mean virtue, but it could mean, well, it's a problem. It gets translated as nature, which there really isn't a Chinese equivalent. But there's another word that's closer to nature anyway. It gets translated as integrity also. Our essential nature. It's rough. Nobody quite knows how. It's the small version of the big that we are. Something like that.
That's one of the things too, that, again, when I write, typically it's always my perspective that I don't really pretend to be an expert about much, and I like just my bearing is I like to find something that's interesting to me, and then I start thinking it through. So my very first introduction to Confucianism and to all this stuff, and all the connections that I was seeing between Emerson and sort of the, let's say, 18th, 19th, 20th century Anglo-Saxon, whether English, British philosophical traditions, and then stuff like more old school Taoist, Confucian stuff, all that stuff. Again, I'm reading the English translations, and I was having some conversations before the publication of that with Wayne Wong, a martial arts studies guy, and Hugh Chan, both of whom know Chinese. I don't. So they were making different comments like, this could mean that, what you're talking about here, this makes sense here, but it might not have been what they said. So yeah, all those different conversations and the filtering issue, even more so than the translation issue, I also found fascinating. Like, it's one thing to read, here's the translation, maybe it doesn't mean this. But then also, here's someone who has sort of read this stuff and taken this stuff in, and now how are they filtering it, and how is it informing what they do and what they create, which comes back to Bruce Lee and how he does that. Yeah, all very interesting.
Right, Dory. There's a personal expression in it element for sure, too. On top of all of that, character. Well, I want to talk about film, but I am I'm undecided on the question of culture versus biology. I tend to be for the very strong definition of culture. That is that it is very hard to communicate across cultures. And I recognize that there is this other thing, there is this, like, I think it's also true that we are all biologically human, and it is possible to get past culture. That there is a shallow version of culture that we can bypass and that we can translate between. But I also think that there is deeper culture, and that a lot is incomprehensible, and it's not an easy problem to solve, because I think that one of my reasons for pointing out the filter problem is that it may be that the filters, no matter how layered they are still stopping us from seeing what Chinese culture really is. And this is important for martial arts, because I'm making the case that Chinese culture, before the Boxer Uprising, before the influence of the YMCA and all of these other evangelical Christian concepts of organizing society, was that martial arts and religion and theater were a single subject, and that they were separated during the 20th century, and that and the resistance to that, I think, comes from the filters that we're looking through. And
that too, like, I would say that one of my priorities too is that it's not that that's left to the side, but let's call that bracketed. But one of my positions or theses, or whatever you want to call it, is that whatever a personal opinion may be about this, whatever, nature versus nurture, culture, biology, all this stuff, where does it come from, what determines it, what's essential, those are conversations that are interesting to have, and I enjoy having them. But when it comes to Bruce Lee in particular, my thing, just as the stickler that I am, is that we can have those conversations, whatever your position, great, we can talk it through, but let's understand, what was Bruce Lee's opinion? Like, that was one of my big things, is just when people will talk, if you want to call it a filter or sort of a putting Bruce Lee into your own little personal box, it's like, what was this dude saying and why? What was he trying to achieve? And there's so much of Bruce that's about transcending these issues, and we're all just one, and yada yada, all that stuff. It's like, I don't like it when people talk about Bruce as like the essentialist Chinese guy and the Chinese hero. It's like, is there a reason you're talking about that? Because that's not his thing. That sounds like your thing, which is fine. You can talk about that, but I want you to talk about it as your thing. Don't say it's Bruce's thing.
Yeah, no, that's a problem. You're not saying I'm saying that, but yeah,
No.
Bruce. I mean, we should for. I think I should say what my position on Bruce Lee is, since it's here.
Sure.
His father was a monumentally famous opera star at the time of his birth, and he grew up in a family of opera people. Actually, his father, it turns out his father was adopted into an opera family so his actual family were just poor, and he had a good voice, but he adopted this family. So all of his Bruce Lee's adopted aunts and uncles were all opera people, and he grew up in that world, so he knew the traditional operas like Fengshen and Shioji and Sangwo and all of these different operas would have been a major part of his childhood. And of course, he learned his physical movement from his family, even if his father supposedly taught him some Tai Chi. But but the people around him, I mean, you can't be active in that world and not have picked up a lot of movement stuff. And so that's my take, is that his Wing Chun part is much less important actually than his opera training, in giving him a base for understanding movement.
And just to circle back to it, because I didn't comment on it at the time, but I wanted to. I also like what you were talking about with sort of the translation stuff and who was reading what when, and that's something that not many people have talked about, and I don't know that I've ever even thought of it. If I have, I forgot I thought about it. But I like that, because one of the things that was another important thing for me to get across is that a lot of people, when they talk about sort of what are Bruce Lee's influences, what's Bruce sort of coming from and working off of, everyone immediately runs right to Taoism. And it's like, yeah, that's there, but you know how much other stuff that dude was reading, and what people usually emphasize sort of his personal library. Like, what was at his house when he died? What's the stuff he wrote and underlined? There's then, you bump it back further in the question of what was he reading like in his formative years? That's a very interesting question. And like, yeah, did he read Walden? I have no clue. What was he reading when he was 14? We barely know what he was reading when he was a further adult, which thankfully the library that he left behind, like Matt Polly, finding certain things like here's the stuff that he was reading. But then even earlier, the stuff that he was reading, that's a whole other question, opens up a whole nother avenue.
I mean, just think about it. From what we know about Bruce Lee, right? He reads a lot, and he's in Hong Kong going to a Christian school, right? And he likes to get in fights and get in trouble. You really think it's possible that he didn't read Huck Finn? I mean, come on. He read Huck Finn. I'm sure he read Huck Finn. Even if he didn't, somebody told him about it.
I can't even remember. It's my own essay, and I can't even remember. I don't know if this is in the published essay or if this is something that I just dropped because the essay is already long enough. But there's a portion of Bruce's writing that seems like a literal transcription of Walden, which makes me wonder, like, he had to have read it at least once.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing, right? Like on the duty of civil disobedience and Twain. I mean, these are taught in Chinese high schools, right? Now even, which is bizarre, right? But they take in both cases, they take those authors' most anti-American stuff, right? Because that's just that is part of Chinese culture at this point in history, is to make it seem like we hate our own country or something because we're self-critical, right? Mm-hmm. What else would I say about Bruce Lee there? Well, let's talk about film a little bit.
Sure.
I'm gonna give my quick intro, because I'm pretty sure yours is longer and more interesting, but I'm gonna give my quick intro to the subject, which is that the biggest star in the world in I don't know, I'm not sure if I got the right year, but about right after World War I is Charlie Chaplin, and his stuff is playing in China. They're taking what theaters they have, and then they're making them into movie theaters, especially in the cities, but actually all over. And then there are a number of other comedians, Buster Keaton. There's another one that was very popular, and it was more popular in China than here. I forgot.
I don't know about popularity-wise, but I know the silent comedians. The other major one would be Harold Lloyd.
Lloyd, right. Lloyd got a huge bump in China. And so because he looked a little Chinese, I guess. But even Laurel and Hardy, I mean, that stuff was huge because it was physical comedy, and that's the kind of comedy they were used to, right?
Yeah.
So that really played well. And then you get Shankai Run, who was a martial artist, who wrote a little bit of sort of true seeming fiction that was supposed to sound true about martial arts, and then he wrote what we call wuxia, or fantasy fiction. He really starts off the modern era of like rewriting the classics, but in a more fantasy way, so sort of replacing religion with fantasy. And you get, between 1927 and 1931, you get 250 films are made in Shanghai, an outrageous number, 18 versions of, or 18 sequels to Shanghai Run's Red Lotus Temple,
right.
Which is all fighting. It's all about fighting, and then there's this ban on film, and one of the arguments for the ban, which was political, which was about controlling people's voices, but one of the arguments was that the god Neja, who I write about in my book, is that I argue that that's what Baguazhang is the dance of this god Neja. That Neja is there was a film made about Neja, and people were going to the movie theater and like burning incense, and every time he came on the stage, they would kowtow, and it was, they were trying to get rid of this religion because he had this big role in the Boxer Uprising, so they've got to ban theater. That was one of the arguments. We should just ban theater. It's becoming its own religion. It's too powerful in the wrong way. It's stopping us from being. Think about this. The way we're making films is stopping us from becoming a modern nation. That's what the Kuomintang argued when they banned the movie theater. And the Shaw brothers had already started there, and in Shanghai, and in Shanghai and in Singapore, and they fled to Hong Kong along with a great deal, a large number of actors and martial artists as well. And that's when Bruce Lee gets his start. Right,
yeah, pretty close. Yeah.
All right, that's my quick history.
Yeah, that's accurate. It's accurate, but yeah, the film nerd in me saying, yeah, this is what I've heard too. And I just, for the nerdy trivia aspect, one of my favorite things from the year that I spent doing my master's at the University of Chicago, they, at the time, complete coincidence, when I happened to be there, they had discovered a print of the previously thought to be lost 1927 film, The Cave of the Silken Web, which was extraordinary to watch because, especially for someone like you, it's basically like film theater. Just all the acrobatics, all the performance. I was like, I have never seen something like this from this era, because all of that stuff with the ban, nothing of just the technological stuff and how long ago it was. The vast majority of silent films worldwide are lost and were destroyed, or people didn't know how to store stuff. So, we showed this already, let's dump it. And so much stuff isn't preserved, either negligence or accidents or repression, whatever the case may be. So all of those films are lost, which is such a tragedy. So to be able to see that film from 1927 right in this period, that's the one and only document that I've ever seen from that era. But it was fascinating. Can
we see that? Is that?
At the time, this was already a number of years ago. I mean, selfishly, but I already saw it, so I never followed up with, does anyone else get to see it? But I know at the time, the big thing was that they had digitized it. It didn't look nice, but it was digitized, and they were in the process of figuring out, okay, now we found this thing. Where's the money going to go? Who has the rights? How are we going to distribute this? Are we going to do DVD, Blu-ray? Which company? That was literally the beginning of having to deal with that. Since then, this was 2013 or 2014. So since then, I don't know if they've done a DVD or a Blu-ray release, but I know that was what they were hoping to do. However long the restoration process takes, if they're going the full shebang and trying to get sort of at the time, it was digitized, but nobody did anything to it. So you're seeing it, it's really rough. And even though for the sake of film history, for the sake of being able to see it, just get it out there, let us see it. But they're not going to release that until it can look good. And I have no clue what that process is like. Like I said, I didn't follow up. So I don't know if that's out there, but I do know it's out there, generally speaking, that was found.
I will comment, in case anybody's listening to this and has some old film in their in their attics, uh, the law in China is anything made in China before 1949 is public domain. So that's nice.
And I know this one, if I'm remembering correctly, this was the way all of these discoveries happen. It's like, why in the hell is it there? But you'll find like a canister, and this was found in, I believe, Norway, like a movie theater or a university or something in Norway. And like, hey, what the hell is this? And then they look like, this is a movie that people have thought has been lost for 75 years. But yeah, it's just random luck. And that's why with stuff like that, that whole period, especially that big explosion of those silent martial arts films and fantasy epics, it's like, fingers crossed, maybe there's going to be more stuff that's going to show up that's no longer lost.
Undoubtedly, this is the thing, is right. There actually hasn't. There's been film studies, but there hasn't been a martial arts studies, and we certainly don't have any money. And the I mean, museums have stuff. Museums and universities have boxes. They have unlabeled boxes. They have boxes with vague labels all over the place.
Even one of the coolest things of my time when I was in the UK also was there's an independent cinema in Bristol called The Cube. And that was originally taken over, if I'm remembering the story correctly, from a long-standing Chinese restaurant. And there was a theater in the back, and one of the types of theaters where like it's the raised platform, so there's a bunch of stuff underneath it. And when they were sort of renovating and changing it over, they found a ton of canisters of old kung fu movies and movie trailers, and they put up together a Blu-ray release, and it's like an hour and a half of all of these trailers of movies that I had never heard of and never seen. And these people just had it because they're coming from there, so it's far more accessible to them at the time. Like, where is all of this stuff? There is so much footage of martial arts cinema history that the majority of people, certainly the great majority of people outside of China, have never seen.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you to link to stuff later. Well, you wrote about, if I'm recalling correctly, you took a great interest in the development of how film is shot, and what it means. You want to talk about that a bit?
I can, and in the martial arts context, I've written about that.
How fighting is shot.
Yeah, so that's another one at the time, my little pet project. I consider myself like a martial arts studies hobbyist who happens to be a film studies guy, and I think I have some stuff to contribute to the field, cinematically speaking. So that's typically where my interest lays, although I'm also an obsessive MMA nerd, so I can help there too. But when it comes to the martial arts cinema history, one of my little pet projects and the thing that I found interesting was that, again, there is sort of a typical way to do things, and there's a received history. And the received history, typically, if you even mention the stuff that you mentioned about the history of the silent era, most people won't even mention that, and they just jump immediately to the Shaw Brothers, post-World War II era, development of the martial arts stuff, your Bruce Lee, your Shaw Brothers, Jim Wing Yu, all that stuff, which, great, accurate, important, but nobody ever talks about other martial arts cinema, and especially nobody talks about the classical Hollywood era, which is where I found some interesting precedents, at the very least, for what I think of as sort of a grappling-based aesthetic. So usually when people are talking about martial arts cinema and martial arts choreography, they're talking about not only a Chinese or broadly Asian history, they're also talking stylistically about predominantly striking-based martial arts. And depending on the kind of martial arts you're capturing, it's just stands to reason that it's going to necessitate different ways of choreographing the action, different ways of shooting the action with the camera, and different ways of editing the action after the fact for the actual film itself. So one of the things that I found interesting, which, as with most things, it's just an accident. I had to do a school assignment in film school doing an editing analysis, and I just happened to pick an editing analysis of the jewelry store action scene and fight scene in Steven Seagal's Marked for Death. So I had to do a homework assignment, and I noticed that it's so strategically edited in relation to Aikido. So there are step-by-step grappling moves, and it seemed like it was step-by-step editing. It's like the aesthetics are matching the martial arts, which was just a little seed of interest. And then as you watch more Seagal movies, you see sort of evolved grappling-based aesthetic. And then you see something like The Bourne Identity, and 12 years later, like, all right, that's very different cinematography. But the basis, the kind of step-by-step, the way you've got to work the editing and the cinematography to help the grappling choreography. You can go back through film history and you go all the way back to G-Men in 1935, and you've got James Cagney doing judo and jiu-jitsu, Blood on the Sun in 1945. This stuff is there that early. And that was just, I was like, okay, somebody had to have noticed this, but how has nobody talked about this? So that was another pet project of just exploring different aesthetic strategies for different martial arts styles.
Well, what that makes me think of is that I think actually there's a great little interview with Jackie Chan talking about what makes great, what he thinks makes great comedy kung fu, and one of the things he talks about is rhythm, and in the dance world, the world of dance videography. Which is not that old, but a standard got created pretty early, which is that you need to have a minimum of two angles, one broad, one follow, and with the camera, right? And then you need to record footfalls, like when the foot hits, because that it's not just the music. You actually need to know when the foot is hitting to get things to sync up, and that's actually key to creating movement on the stage, is knowing where those footfalls happen. And so there's that sound rhythm element. And I know I've sat over in editors, when they're working, I've sat over their shoulder and tried to figure out what they're doing. And I certainly have enormous respect for great editors, but also the ability to work with rhythm in film is really important there, and kind of key to stage combat.
And in this context too, one of the things that, once I had this little kernel of an idea in my head, one of the things that helped me the most sort of start thinking through this, and it just so happened to also be about Steven Seagal, was an essay from 1998 from a guy named Aaron Anderson. And Aaron Anderson was in the military. He had combat training, martial arts training. He taught stage combat, and he also happened to be a scholar. And he wrote an essay he wrote an essay, I think it was called Kinesthesia in Martial Arts Films. And he's doing a kind of dance rhythmic analysis of, I guess you could say, the percussive structure of Steven Seagal's fight scene in the bar and Out for Justice. And then he added that with a broad dance-based analysis of Jackie Chan's fight scenes. So these are like early attempts to think through and analyze the aesthetics of combat from a choreographic perspective. That stuff is right there.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Have you ever done any stage combat?
Stage combat? No. I've only done the occasional training of just martial arts stuff in a gym. Never done any stage anything.
Okay, so stage combat, having done some stage combat, so if you're doing like, Western stage, Shakespeare, for instance, there's a whole thing about, distance. So like you want to be a foot to a foot and a half away when you strike. So you're creating, it's like, It's pretty hard for me to do stage combat on myself. Well, I can pull my own hair. But like, right. Yeah. But well, there is a tradition. I mean, Larry, Curly, and Moe, right, had actually a fair amount of wrestling type things, and like, what was that classic, trick? There's all the wonderful stuff with slapstick, right? That built in slapstick was called slapstick because there was such a thing as a slapstick, right? Which is a stick that has been cut down the middle, so it's double. So when it hits, it makes a really loud noise, but it doesn't hurt. And so in film, because of the possibility of intimacy, the stage combat gets a lot closer. You're looking at more like 5 to 6 inches away.
Yeah.
So you have to set the choreography tighter, in fact. And so rhythm becomes it's already important. In fact, there's a name for it in stage combat. It's called cues and naps. So the cue is, I'm going to hit you now. And then you go, right? So it's setting up a rhythm. And then the nap is the sound, right?
Okay.
So that's the sound you make wherever it is. Sometimes it's on stage, sometimes it's off stage. In theater, they're called, in film, it's called Foley's, right? And they're done after the fact. But you often, if you've trained people in stage combat and they're doing film, they will have naps too, just to keep the rhythm.
Yeah.
And of course, Chinese martial arts is full of slapping yourself techniques and stamping the ground, which was all part of an older tradition of stage combat.
And then there's also probably the most famous aesthetic breakdown of martial arts cinema and choreography was David Bordwell, who's like the biggest film scholar ever. He wrote a book called Planet Hong Kong, and he's breaking down things, and he analyzes it according to what he calls a pause, burst, pause pattern. So he's trying to break down this kind of rhythm and do this type of rhythmic analysis as well. So it's there, whether it's explicitly sort of dance-based or theater-based, like an Aaron Anderson, or whether you're just intuitively recognizing there's got to be some kind of steps, there's got to be some kind of rhythm, and you find something like a David Bordwell. That's something that's there already with the precedent in the film studies world. But one of the things that I found difficult as well is that it was rare when you have a film scholar like David Bordwell, for example, giant film scholar, never done martial arts ever in his life. So he's got the aesthetic stuff down pat. But then to be able to try to combine that is, for me, and then I know, again, someone like Wayne Wong, who is doing a lot of really cool martial arts cinema stuff as well, that if there's a way to sort of introduce insights from actual combat experience, actual stage combat experience, whatever the case may be, but from that kind of performative or practical base, can you then find different insights or different things to notice, different ways to conceptualize things on the aesthetic and the cinematic level, which, to go back to the grappling thing, was another thing that I found interesting, because I think Paul Bowman has a couple of ideas that he finds it interesting that it doesn't matter where you're coming from as a film fan. If you like martial arts, you watch martial arts movies like documentaries. They're like treated like training footage. Like, okay, yeah, there's a story, there's a plot, there's a character, but look at those moves. How do you do that? You think you can replicate that? Sort of on a different life of its own. And one of the things that, again, I found interesting was before I ever took my first Aikido class, I tried every Steven Seagal move that I could on all of my friends and even my unfortunately reluctant sister. Like, just, okay, is this aesthetic structure also somehow pedagogically useful? If you know the fact that Steven Seagal was a teacher and an instructor, is there also a way to understand this as a way to more effectively communicate these martial arts techniques? Yes, you have the aesthetic component of, I want this to look cool. I want this with the ADR, the Foley. I want this to sound cool. I want you to hear the snap when I break this guy's arm. Yeah, that's there too. But also the look at how this technique is performed. Look at the actual skill involved. Look at, maybe you can replicate this if you're a martial artist as well. And that too comes with, this needs to be shot a certain way. This needs to be edited a certain way so you can see what's actually going on step by step and sort of reconstruct the technique. So that, again, sort of with this martial arts studies initiative, that when you find these different disciplines, different initiatives that they have going, is there something else that you can contribute from a particularly martial arts related perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I should point out that most martial arts are rhythmic anyway, right? I mean, I mean, I don't know, wrestling not so obviously as sparring,
Right.
but still, almost certainly anything standing up because you're moving your feet is going to be rhythmic, and dueling for sure is highly rhythmic, and it's just you're using rhythm for deception, or or to create illusions and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And Well, one of the things that, as a martial arts teacher myself, um, when YouTube first happened, my reaction to YouTube was, oh, this is a way, like, I didn't really think of it as like, oh, this is a way to teach people. I thought that was ridiculous. You're going to have like actually meet me and touch me and see me from different angles. And, it's like, it's not going to work. I didn't think that. My thought was, oh, this is an amazing way for people to communicate about martial arts. Like, it's going to be direct. I'm going to make a video and you're going to make one in response. And we're going to have this, we're going to be able to have these dialogues across long distances about how things work. And that's what I started doing initially. But it kind of got swamped with what I would say is, a claim that something is being taught,
Right.
a false claim mostly, and a kind of what I would just call YouTube martial arts theater, which is like, does it look real? And of course, there are various crime scene videos too, but there's so much just like, can we make it look real?
Right.
Video out there, and I don't know. It's crazy to me that there isn't more awareness of how staged everything is.
Yeah, and that's always the double-edged sword with technology. But so yeah, it's like sort of the technologized McDojos and the people just peddling bullshit. And now I can use technology to do it. Like, yeah, when technology comes out, it's a new avenue to do the same old crap. That's definitely there. And then the flip side with technology is, from sort of the, whatever you want to call it, the purist perspective or practical perspective, however you want to think of it, I do think that there is a stage where you've got to be in the flesh. You've got to touch, you've got to throw, you've got to feel. But I also like that that's sort of like a technological entryway. It's sort of like a first step, which has followed all through the different stages in technology. Because back in the day, I mean, the MMA nerd in me will come out here, but James Thompson was a British MMA fighter who famously became a meme because he was talking about his early fights and like, yeah, I feel comfortable. I watched a lot of DVDs. It's like, okay, that's not training. But then that is a joke. But then when you go back through history, when MMA was first starting, and there isn't a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym on every corner in the mid-90s. So someone like a Pat Miletich, who was a pioneer in MMA training and coaching, was watching Renzo Gracie BJJ instructional VHS tapes. It's like, all right, I don't have a way to train this, but this is better than nothing. This is step one. Evan Tanner as well, another legendary early MMA pioneer, looking at stuff just with VHS. Then comes DVD, and then comes YouTube. And it gives you that sort of first step, like, I'm not at a gym, I can't afford it yet, but let me try this crap on my friend. And I have a sense of this. When you then get to a gym, it's like, now the real training will start. At some point, there's going to be a stage where you've got to be doing this in person, but that does offer you that other sort of internet pedagogy aspect that I find very interesting.
Well, I can't help interjecting here that the history, the history of jiu-jitsu in Brazil, for instance, was initially spread by wrestling stars, pro wrestlers, and that it was a type of theater. Well, like, I guess the Gracies were in the circus, right? That's the story. They were in the circus, and with these circus wrestlers. And the late 1800s had a lot of this circus. I mean, I've seen various sort of programs, saved programs from, the Japanese warrior, they weren't called ninjas. They were like princess so-and-so, fights, 50 men or whatever, like some, that stuff was touring. These Japanese circus people were touring America in the 1800s and Europe. And what we know about Barnum and Bailey and Bill Hickok, who was actually this is great. I just read this. The Wild Bill Hickok had what is it called? The Buffalo Bill. That's his first name. That's what William Cody is his formal name. Buffalo Bill had a boxer show. It was the Boxer Rebellion. Like the second half of his show was just the Boxer Rebellion live. And so whatever that was, they had Sioux Indians playing the role of Chinese in this. And it was huge, touring all over. There's an account of Mark Twain walking out. He was friends with Buffalo Bill, but he walked out on the Boxer uprising. The wrestling and fake, wrestling before film and cameras, a lot of wrestling was fake, and we don't really know how much of MMA is fake. I mean, there's lots of things that stop it from being fake, like money and the way in which people are sponsored. And so I'm not actually arguing that it is fake now, but it could be.
Well, I could talk from this, again, the MMA nerd perspective, but one of the things that I don't think is written enough about, and it hasn't been explored a lot, part of it is because of the intense secrecy of the Japanese at this time, and then it's just kind of held over. But I am an enormous fan of the Japanese MMA organization Pancrase. And Pancrase preceded the UFC by a few months. They had their first event in 1993, and most famous because Ken Shamrock was competing there before he went over to UFC 1. And Pancrase came out of the Japanese pro wrestling scene in the 80s. So Ken Shamrock got his start with catch wrestling, and he came up with that lineage. And he's training with Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki, who are the two guys who break off from pro wrestling and create their own shoot fighting organization because they love the techniques, they love the training. Let's do this for real. Let's actually test this stuff. Well, so the story goes. I'm digging deep into my reserves of my MMA memory. The first Pancrase show, there was 57 minutes of combat. And they're like, this doesn't work for a show. We need more. So they actually had, for the first few years, it was sort of that combination of we need the theater aspect, we need the stage aspect, we need the performance aspect, and we need the fight aspect. So they tried to figure out ways to do that. There were some worked fights, and there was what was known as carrying. So you'll have a fighter who's very skilled, like a Funaki or a Suzuki, and maybe they can tap this guy out in 50 seconds, a minute and a half, but they're going to stretch it to maybe 8.5 minutes. So you're getting it's not fake, but it's not just coming out guns blazing real. So you have a lot of that, particularly in the Japanese scene. By the same token, in the UFC in the early days, it's not coming from the theatrical roots, but it's still coming from sort of the stereotype of this seedy, old school noir-like boxing arena with the fixed fights and all this, that there were a number of well-known fixed fights in the early UFC days, whether it's managers with conflicting or just saying, I've got two fighters, this one's got a better shot of winning the final, but you take the dive, let him choke you out in 12 seconds, save him some energy for the finals. There was that going on. And then finally, when you get Pride, which comes after Pancrase, again in Japan, you still have that pro wrestling connection, and there are a number of worked fights there, most famously Mark Coleman throwing a fight to Nobuhiko Takada. So that's definitely there in the MMA history. How much is going on now? There's always speculation, every other MMA event. That one looked fixed. It's hard to determine because you don't have this very clear explanation. Like, they're coming from pro wrestling, pro wrestlers, they know this. Okay, maybe there's going to be something of this going on. But in the history of MMA, that is absolutely there, and it's absolutely a part of that lineage.
Because a lot of times we're trying to show in film as something very real, but you have to be really good at fake to create real, which by the way is very Taoist thing to say. This is an expression, make real fake and fake real. It's the culture. It's the culture of theater. In fact, the culture of dreaming on the stage being a type of dream, that becomes a metaphor for a more comic type of religion, which is me ranting here a little bit about how often we try to understand Chinese religion from Christianity, which is tragic, right? It's fundamentally a tragic religion where you have this idea of a belief. These are my beliefs, and no matter what you do to me, I'm going to keep my beliefs, right? That's tragedy. I will not change them. They are true, and they are right. Whereas a Chinese tradition is comic. It's like, okay, well, if my beliefs aren't working, I'm going to change them like a lot. It's going to be a big change. We're going to come back with a new deity, new set of precepts, new, and so it's it very much ties into the theater. Really, it's a really clean, seamless connection to film, in fact. And one of the places where I think this is really hot, and would be hotter if it wasn't completely banned in mainland China, is horror. There's a lot of crossover with what's real and what's not real in horror as well. And it seems to me that horror has been, it doesn't matter that it is better, but it has been somewhat better at communicating the religious traditions of China, pushing them forward than Kung Fu itself. Maybe that's too strong a statement, because I actually think of Kung Fu as a religious tradition, in the sense that in the simplest sense of it, it is, how do you make yourself better, right? The Kung Fu movies are all about how do you make the better choice, and how do you become through your montage of training a better person, and anyway, are you familiar with the horror genre? Do you want to say something about that?
I'm not familiar with the Asian horror stuff as much as a lot of people who study that stuff. I knew someone in the UK who studied that, but the only thought that I have in that vein is sort of the selfish way of pulling it from what you just said to talk about something that's connected insofar as it's horror, but not connected insofar as anything you just said. But the only thought that I have is, one of the things that I find interesting, because I find a lot of things interesting about Steven Seagal, one of the things that I find interesting is that his action fighter persona is unique in the history of martial arts cinema, for sure, but even action cinema more broadly. People often joke about the fact that he's invincible. He's a superhero. You don't even land a shot. He just destroys you immediately. And that's not 100% true. He does get hit and bleed in a couple of movies. But by and large, when you're talking about his persona is, I'm here now, you're going to die. And that gives you a very different sort of action formula. But it also, he's done a couple of movies that either dip their toe into the horror genre, or he did one movie that was like a supernatural horror movie with vampires called Against the Dark from 2009. But his 1990 movie, Marked for Death, has some horror elements with the Jamaican posse, and they're very into voodoo, so it's very Angel Heart-ish, and it brings those horror conventions. And then The Glimmer Man in 1996, which is made right after Seven, so it's got the whole religious serial killer theme, but the religion is just masking a crime syndicate. But you're dealing with horror conventions, and the fact that Seagal, A, is there, and B, has the martial arts prowess, he destroys horror by his mere presence, in the sense that when you watch a horror movie and someone's walking, the camera's very slow, what you're supposed to feel is tension. You're supposed to feel, oh no, something is going to happen. And then Steven Seagal walks in, and there is no tension. Nothing's going to happen to him. He's going to kill everybody. So he comes in, and it's like a weird cathartic experience of, I don't have to worry about, oh no, are you going to get killed by the killer? Steven Seagal's here. The killer's going to die now. And It's fascinating to me the way that his mere presence changes the conventions of an entire cinematic genre.
It's relief. Yeah, yeah. That's an interesting icon. That the invincible. I mean, that in the Chinese theatrical tradition, that they're like, in a sense, like heroes often die, but they come back to the stage. They're already even in comedy, the characters are considered ghosts, because they keep dying and coming back, or they live forever, because they're on the stage over 500 years or whatever. But invulnerability is of course a major issue in religion. I've been arguing anyway that the golden elixir, which is a major component of the Taoist tradition, conferred immortality. That's basically what it does in its most abstract sense. But in the popular imagination, it was associated with that type of invulnerability. And so you get this golden bell and iron shirt, which are sort of, I don't know, localized to non-Taoist versions of invulnerability training that seems to be a part of almost all martial arts before 1900. And of course, it's part of every comedy fight scene, because the whole point of punching somebody in a comedy is that they don't really get hurt. They get humiliated. Maybe their nose gets broken. Maybe they're angry. There's lots of things that can happen, but they don't really get hurt. Everyone is in a comedy has invulnerability, and always the heroes always, even when they get slammed, they come back up. And you're like, well, you're in the next scene, and so to me, those things are just like linked together, and it's strange. I don't know exactly how to talk about it, but I think it forms it. It does something to our culture that we have these myths of invulnerability all over the place. So that's something we certainly have in common with Chinese culture now. I'm not sure we always had it, but we certainly have it now. Punch and Judy, I guess.
And then what you just said made me think of two things. Number one, something I didn't mention earlier when you were talking about the slapstick tradition, but then I'll come back to that. But the first thing too is that with the different cultures and the sort of culture clash or melding or whatever, but I like the thought that I just had now with Steven Seagal's persona being that invincible persona, but what predominates, especially in Hollywood fighting, is you can either call it Underdog Syndrome, which is specifically like Rocky Syndrome. Like you have to be on the brink of defeat and be absolutely destroyed, and then you're allowed to come back really fast and win. It's like you have to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, which I don't know if is that some kind of American myth or ethos, or is it just from Rocky, but it seems to come, especially martial arts movies happen to be coming in the 70s into the 80s in American culture particularly. And Rocky's got to get thrashed by Apollo, and then he just comes back. And then you have Jean-Claude Van Damme just coming back, and you've got this trope that comes all the time, which makes Seagal stand out even more, that it's like, yeah, that's not what we're used to seeing. You're supposed to get destroyed, which, to me personally, it's kind of a pet peeve. I really don't like that trope. It has to be organic, and it very rarely is, which is why I like Bruce's Way of the Dragon. He's pretty damn invulnerable until he meets Chuck Norris, when it's like, okay, this makes sense. You've got an evenly matched couple here, and one goes a little bit over here and starts to lose, comes back a little bit, and you get a little bit of that give and take, and that's a little more organic the way that Bruce handled it. But typically, I call that underdog syndrome. Like, I got to watch 6 minutes of him getting beat up before I can see the guy who's clearly better win. That kind of bugs me on the convention level. But that's just a little aside. To connect back to what you were talking about with the slapstick tradition and the comedy and invulnerability, interesting. In those early slapstick days, I wrote a chapter for a book as a companion to the action film. So it's just a film studies publication going through action movies. And I wrote the opening chapter, which structured chronologically. But I'm talking about the invention of film in the 1890s up to around the 30s and 40s. Mm-hmm. So I was looking at some Buster Keaton stuff is interesting because it's very athletic. But Charlie Chaplin is the most interesting because it's really physical, and there are literally fight scenes. And I talked about the movie Easy Street, which is a short film from 1917, I believe. And that is fascinating because I believe Jackie Chan talked about liking Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd. There's the iconic image of Jackie Chan replicating Harold Lloyd hanging off the clock. But Charlie Chaplin's fight scenes, that's like Jackie Chan's playbook. And especially stuff like Easy Street, where you punch in the big guy and it doesn't hurt him because he's too big. And then he's outside the window and you drop like a stove on his head. And it just keeps him down enough time for you to run away. That whole comedic structure with that invulnerability stuff, that's certainly there in those early slapstick days. And then again, you see that whole cultural filter. So here before film, here in this culture in film. Later on, you get Jackie Chan sort of inheriting these two different traditions, which have the shared tropes and motifs, all of that stuff that interconnectedness. That's why I like watching a lot of movies.
Oh man, Chaplin. Yeah. Yeah, he is wonderful. Let's see, is there something else I should ask you about? Well, since we got you here and you watch a lot of movies, how about favorite kung fu movies?
Well, I am a stickler, so it depends how that's phrased and what we're meaning here. Kung fu movies, favorite like Hong Kong martial arts movies. I mean, it's cheap to say Bruce Lee because Bruce Lee is my favorite thing in the universe. So Bruce Lee movies, I do love. But I'm also a very big fan of Chang Che's films. And I think that, especially in the film studies world, there's a little prestige attached to King Hu. And people love Come Drink With Me. They should. People love A Touch of Zen. I don't really think you should. But I like Chang Che's stuff, from The One-Armed Swordsman and The Assassin, the stuff that he did in the late 60s. And then when he starts working with the Five Deadly Venoms, I just liked his stuff because it's a little bit more intense and a little more engaging than most of the martial arts cinema that was coming out at that time. And then later on, I have to say that probably the best martial arts movie of the last 20 years was Donnie Yen and the First Ip Man. I absolutely love that movie, and I love him in that movie. And I think that fight scene with all the karate guys is one of the greatest things put on celluloid. Not celluloid anymore, digital, but one of the best things in film.
Since we're talking old stuff, what about Zatoichi?
I like the Japanese samurai stuff, but I don't love it. Like, I like Akira Kurosawa's films, but that's from a cinematic perspective. Like, I prefer, this is coming from, like, let's call it the aesthetic perspective. I don't like watching weapon-based stuff, and I don't like doing weapons-based stuff. So that's a personal bias that I have to put on the record. So that's why, like, the sword play stuff and weapon-based stuff, it's not my favorite. It doesn't get me. I like it when you lost the weapon, or okay, now let's do hand-to-hand and let's get at it. It's like, okay, now I'm going to tune in. That's just always been a little biased of mine. So it's not that I don't like Bruce swinging the nunchucks, but I like the hand-to-hand fight.
I have a theory that I haven't explored that I'm wondering if you have a comment on, which is that Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a cultural pivot point in people being able to see fight scenes in the American world.
Yes, and this is something Paul likes talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer too. I have to say that wasn't in my personal world, which means I didn't connect up with the people who were influenced by it, which means I can only talk about it from an outsider perspective. So I know that was a very big sort of cultural moment, and the fact that martial arts and fight choreography was so prominently displayed on television. It's not the movies. You don't have to go to the theater. You see it in your house week to week. That's definitely a big thing. But what I would pair it to, I wouldn't challenge that, but I would add to it something that Paul also recently talked about, because there's someone at Cardiff who also studies this. But growing up as a child, the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers were also very big with that. And Buffy kind of gets the older group, and the Power Rangers get the younger group. And I think those two things together in that era in the 90s, you've got the people sort of hooked on their TVs, and you're getting martial arts to them.
So where does martial arts studies go from here?
I don't know where it goes. I can tell you where I would like it to go. I have no idea where it goes, but I know it's hard for me to say number one, because in as much as I do consider myself something of an interloper, something of a hobbyist, that I do film studies and I happen to love martial arts, so that's why I talk about it. There's a part of me that I don't really want to say what we should do, but then on the other hand, I got opinions, so I'll say them. But one of the things that I would like is what I kind of build to towards the end of the Bruce Lee essay, is that I don't feel that there's enough conversation about the methods and the tools that we use to study things. I think there's too much taken for granted, and there's too much that's just accepted and kind of, I'm doing my thing, you do your thing, and just leave me alone and let me talk about stuff. And there's no real I don't think that's a good way to do that. Or maybe we should do that here, but not there. There isn't a lot of sort of metacritical or methodological exploration, argument, debate. Part of that, I think, is just because a lot of people are already in sort of the same vein. So if you disagree with it, you're kind of an anomaly already. And then the second part, I do think this is endemic. This is a problem in academia, not just martial arts studies. But I also think everyone's egos are way too precious, and there isn't that type of adventurousness and openness to where every time I'm going to engage in a conversation, I might change my mind. I might stop thinking what I think. That just isn't on the table. It's not the way that people do things. So those are the kind of little, whatever you want to call them, academic pet peeves or intellectual hopes and dreams. But those are the things that I would like to see changed a little bit. And then, of course, I have my own little biases and things. I wish there was more of this. I wish there was less of that. But on the large scale, I would like people to just interrogate more. Why do they do what they do the way that they do it? How are other people doing things? Are there things we can be doing better? Are there things we should stop doing? Those types of questions. I think martial arts studies is big enough. There's been enough published. There are people who are sort of conversant enough with what's been going on and how it's been done that I think the next stage should be that type of, okay, what's all on the table? What don't we need? What can we get rid of? What should we introduce that we haven't really explored yet? That would be where I would like to see things go. If I were a betting man, I'd say it doesn't go there, but that's what I'd like. No offense to anybody. It's just that seems to be the way that academia goes. It's just very fad-like. It's very
well, let me dig on that, because I think we're almost done here. That was actually a great ending. I could always cut there, but what do you see the likely problems?
I think the biggest problem is just to say that it's a problem of ego. It seems like I'm going to be insulting people. It's only an indirect insult, but it's just, I don't think people should be so precious with their ideas and with their methods. So, for instance, we didn't talk about her very much, which was surprising, but I like Ayn Rand. Nobody likes Ayn Rand. Everybody hates Ayn Rand. But I like her. There are some things I like, there are some things I don't. And I have no problem saying that objectivism, to me, is the most practical and intelligent sounding philosophical basis that I've come across. And yet there's stuff that Ayn Rand said that I think she's absolutely out of her mind. And I have no problem saying so in essays published in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies. That's the way that it should be. It's just, you shouldn't be wedded to stuff so deeply to where if someone else says, that doesn't really make much sense to me. Well, you don't understand. How dare you say that? It's like, no, that's not the response. It's all right, let me try to explain this. And then if I hear myself trying to explain something and I sound like I'm talking myself into a corner and it doesn't make sense coming out of my mouth, should I revise this? Should I think something different? That type of openness, I don't see it. And I think that's the biggest impediment.
Well, let's solve it. Let's solve the problem right now. Let's just say you're in a position. I don't know. You got your tenured position. You got 10 graduate students working under you. You've got a big budget. You have contacts outside of academia that are even that are really interested in the work. I'm already dreaming here, but let's just say that's happening. What do you do? How do you solve that? Problem's still there. How do you solve it?
I'm not a pessimistic person. I'm not a dark person, but I'm a little jaded even for my youth. But I don't think that that's something that can be solved above a certain level, meaning that if you've been entrenched in the academic world, you've been kind of doing your thing for a certain amount of time, I don't like to just give up hope and to say you're beyond helping, but in a way so I think the problem is that there's a certain level where if you've been in academia for long enough, I'm not going to reach you. You're not going to be sort of gotten to. It's just you're stuck in your ways in that old dogs can't learn new tricks kind of way. I think the only way it changes is over a long period of time, starting from the ground up, meaning starting with people who are just coming into academia. So when I'm with, sounds terrible to say, I know, but when I'm with like a group of academics, I don't feel the same thing that I feel when I'm in a room full of students. Like, it's just a different world and it's a different openness. And I did a class last term called Cinema Analysis and Criticism. And the whole premise was you watch a movie and then you come in for a week and you just talk about it. And then you come in the next week and you talk through scholarship on it. And that kind of sort of openness, and you think this, you think that, say it, and let's think through whatever the hell you think. That was every single student. Just, this is the best. You don't get to do this in other classes. It's like, why? That's a problem. This is what this is supposed to be, both in the educational context and then in a scholarly context. It should be, here's what I think, and I'm not going to censor myself. I'm not going to worry about maybe I'm wrong. You're supposed to be learning every step of the way. And that, I don't think there is a change that can be made that's going to flip that switch in someone's head. It's just I can bring you to the water, but whether you drink or not is your call, and I'm not going to stick around to shove your head in the water.
But just to be more provocative, I don't know why I'm echoing. You would like to hear, I mean, you would like a conference where people actually behaved like they were 18 or 20 and just went for it.
I mean, yeah, that's one of the things too, is that I don't ever set out to be like, whatever you want to call it, like a provocateur. I don't try to be provocative, but sometimes I am. But it's just that shouldn't be a hindrance. Like, if you come up on something and think, maybe people won't like this, this isn't the way that most people talk about this, that shouldn't stop you. You should explore that, and you should be able to explore it in that group setting, and that should be welcomed and encouraged and enjoyed. But it isn't, and that's unfortunate. But like I said, this is an academic problem. This isn't just a martial arts studies problem. Martial arts studies is a small footnote to the larger institution that has these types of problems.
Yeah, well, I mean, I try to stay optimistic, but if you really, push me, I'm. Well, you mentioned Thomas Kuhn before we, in our email exchange or somewhere. Oh, in your essay actually.
Yeah, one of the essays I do cite him.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not sure this is. I'm not sure that this is the traditional way of citing Thomas Kuhn, but I would summarize Thomas Kuhn as, you have to wait until they die for something to change.
I mean, yeah, and in that vein, there's Noel Carroll, who's another one of the big film scholars. In 1996, him and that guy, David Bordwell, they published a book called Post-Theory, Reconstructing Film Studies. And the whole initiative was after a decade and a half of them separately writing essays and books critiquing the general paradigm of film studies, your Althusserian, Lacanian, psychoanalytic Marxism, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
And they published that book. And Noel Carroll's point was something that I kind of see the wisdom in, was that if you're in this game for long enough, it becomes less about, I want to figure stuff out, and more about, I want to protect what I've got. And it becomes this defensive position rather than, if you want to think of it as an offensive position. But it's here's what I think. Here's my nice little box of beliefs. Don't touch it. Don't take anything out. Don't put in anything new. Leave me alone. I have this here, and this is what I'm playing with. This is what I'm exploring. And it's just, I do agree with the Kuhnian thing. It's an age question. It's a habit question. It's how do you break out of that? Again, to go back to Mr. Seagal, it's often lampooned, but I think one of the most sophisticated, profound moments in cinema, I'm standing by that statement, is in On Deadly Ground, when Seagal plays the hand slap game with Mike Starr, and then he stands up and the melodramatic music kicks in, and Seagal looks at him and says, what does it take to change the essence of a man? It's an unbelievably sappy, melodramatic, cheesy thing, and you laugh with Seagal with his ponytail and his fringed jacket. But that is a question that has haunted me for so long. It's, what can I say to you that will flip that switch? I don't know how to do that. And that's one of the fascinating things with Carl Rogers, another one of Bruce's unacknowledged important influences, the idea of the helping relationship. As a psychotherapist, you can call him pessimistic in the sense that I can't help you unless you want to be helped. So you can come here and we can talk, but until you open up, I can't do anything. I'm not a magician. I'm only going to help you if you want it. People are only going to change if they want to. So then the question is, well, how do you make them want to? I don't know. I can just say what I think, and either you come around or you don't. Hopefully the conversation can be an actual conversation, not just evasions and a compendium of logical fallacies, which is usually what happens. Either way, there's no way to force someone to change. You can just hope that they will. The only weapon you have is time and patience, and beyond that, I just say what I say and hope that it changes, and we'll see if it does.
Well, on that note, I am a magician, but usually the goal of magicians is to keep people in their box so they can't figure out what you're doing. But hey, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Kyle.
Pleasure to you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.